Whether your beer is in a bottle, can, or glass, kick back and relax. It's better on draft.
Welcome, everybody, to the Michigan series, episode number 20. My name is Ken. Thank you so much for joining. Going around and getting to see what the hosts are drinking right now. I'll start off with myself. I am drinking a Paradiso IPA. We've still got 2 more shows left during dry January, so I am staying dry. Rob, how are you? What are you drinking?
I'm doing all right. I am drinking right now a chocolate chili stout, which comes from Outhouse Ales out in New Hampshire. It says it doesn't taste like it came from an outhouse. I'm having trouble kind of agreeing with that statement.
Yeah, that name already is a turnoff. No way.
Oh, I mean, it's no different than the brown note out of that
don't drink
against the grain. Dan, what are you drinking?
Following along with you, probably because I'm going through a weight cut right now. So sticking with the dry stuff, I'm drinking one of these Lagunitas Hoppy Refreshers. And then I got one of these in the mail. It's a 5-ounce can of Heineken 0.0.
Oh, nice.
Oh,
yeah.
Okay.
Wendy, what do you got over there?
You got Heineken in the mail?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it came as a free sample with something. It's Heineken 0.0. I mean,
interesting. I'm just curious as to how that happens. Anyway, sorry, I apologize. I am drinking a Dep 2, the Imperial Stout from Detroit. I was lucky enough to have a beer fairy drop that off to me, and it is delicious. Delicious.
Jealous.
And Nick, what are you drinking?
I am drinking a Boulevard Brewing Space Camper and a Groundbreaker IPA number 5.
I feel like Nick just likes to drink all the beers that he gets from the show like 2 months after the show happens. I mean, you're drinking them. That's what matters.
At least as long as I'm drinking them, right?
That's right. Well, we do have a guest. She just released her newest book, which is Michigan Beer. Patti, how are you? What are you drinking? And we'll start with that.
Well, thank you for having me on. First of all, this is so exciting. Next, this is kind of sad because as I've gotten older, I don't really get alcohol hangover headaches. I get sugar induced headaches. And somebody brought in donuts to the teacher's lounge. And so I did not restrain myself. And I had a donut for breakfast and a donut for lunch. So when I got home from school, my head was just popping off and I had to take a migraine pill, and I can't drink on migraine pills. So I have just my water from the Soda Stream, my bubble water. So
I promise you, as someone who's had a migraine for the last 45 days since he caught COVID, you can drink on migraine pills. It's just not proper to. But this isn't your first book. Before we dive into this book, what other books do you have on the shelves these days?
So my first book, they've basically been geared around history. And I kind of started super, super local with a history book about the People's Food Co-op in Ann Arbor, where I live. And that publisher, unfortunately, it was a local publisher. They have gone out of business. So there might be some copies floating around at the co-op. Then I wrote a history book for Arcadia History Press about downtown Ann Arbor. And then I got a little bit bigger to a book for the same publisher about Ann Arbor, history of the whole city. And then I went and now we have the Michigan Beer book.
All right.
I'm on mute.
You're on mute, Rob. There you go.
You just pulled a Nick that time.
But I caught it. It was just I had too many windows open and I couldn't get to the button just to click that off.
Well, the main thing is that you did a Nick. That's the main thing. So.
Right. Taken care of. All right. So a couple questions that I wanted to ask. Obviously, we were talking about, we want to start it off with talking about your book, which obviously titled Michigan Beer, A Heady History. I guess the first question is in looking at that book, why write a book about the history of Michigan beer?
A couple of reasons. It kind of married my two interests, and we have such an amazing beer state in Michigan. We're so lucky. My dad lives in Florida half the year, and I guess it's gotten a little better, but it's just not a beer state at all. No offense, Florida, if anyone's listening. But we are so incredibly lucky to have such amazing breweries now and in the past. And I wanted to give a nod to those people that started it, that came here, in most cases from other places that maybe weren't so amazing. And they came here and they started something and made it happen and made it work. So I wanted to honor them. And as someone who just loves history in general, I just want to give a nod and, to the people who we didn't just wake up and it was here. I mean, somebody had to lay the groundwork. So in honor of our wonderful state and our breweries, I wanted to get to honor them and get people reading and thinking about the people that were here before us.
Mm-hmm. Now, as a state, we've definitely, as far as beer is concerned, we've definitely had our triumphs. I mean, we're basically looking at we're almost like, I think we're over 400 breweries and brew pubs. Mm-hmm. That basically puts us, I think, 5th overall in the country. And, we put out a bunch of countless beers that make it pretty difficult, at least from my standpoint, of out-of-state breweries to even try to get themselves a decent foothold in the market that we already have. But the one thing I'm actually kind of curious about is about kind of the setbacks and the failures. Mm-hmm. And I'm curious as far as what you've seen in terms of like looking at the history, and probably more so just like looking at where Michigan beer is or where it's been in like the last 10 to 15 years. Mm-hmm. Is there anything in the Michigan beer scene that has given you any type of cause of concern about, the breweries that are out and closures and things of that nature?
The scope of the book is we kind of end right after World War II when there was a lot of consolidations and a lot of things happening. And had this not been a COVID book, it would have ended there. But COVID, I had to mention it in the book. I actually pitched this book to my editor. I'm going to kind of a long about way to answer this. So I had started thinking about writing this book probably summer of 2019. I'm a teacher. I'm off in the summer. And I don't know if folks probably know this, but for a nonfiction book, you do a proposal, a publisher buys it, or, you secure the contract and then you write it. Whereas fiction, you do the book first and then you try and sell it. So I do a proposal and I just kind of farted around. And finally I submitted it to my editor the first week of March, 2020, which what else happened the first week of March 2020? And
How fitting of a timeline.
Right. My timing's always impeccable. So they're on the East Coast. And I remember at one point he's like, hey, is anything happening? And he's like, stuff's kind of, and I'm like, no, nothing. And then like that week, it was Thursday that I went to an exercise class. And by the time I came out, I had a text saying, hey, we're shutting down and schools were closed. So we can talk about this. We should talk about this later, how that affected the book. But I say that to say that normally the publisher wants you to end your book in the past, like in the 50s, 60s. Sometimes they go to 70s. They're a great publisher and they are history focused. However, he and I discussed this, and because COVID is it's COVID, it has to be in there, right? So at one point I was going to try and list breweries we had to say goodbye to, but I didn't want to do that, and it's kind of depressing. So I will say that COVID absolutely concerns me in the sense that the brew pubs, and this is what I learned during the book. I knew this, but I learned this during the book, that brewers are incredible the way they can pivot and just, am I allowed to swear? Is that okay?
Yep.
And they can make shit happen. Like, we can talk about prohibition and stuff, but they, I can't imagine. I mean, I didn't know which way was up when they said, hey, school's closed first for 3 weeks, then for the rest of the year. And I was just flailing about, crazy. And brewers had to pivot into, carry out food, let's get growlers going, let's get canning going, let's get drive up and cocktails to go and all this stuff. But that said, and they did a fantastic job. That said, we did lose a lot. So that would be my first one. Second one, a lot of people talk about oversaturation, and that's not been a huge concern to me because I know some of the history. Now I know more that, it isn't that every town had a brewery back in the day, but there was a place. There was a lot of them. There was the place that made the beer. So I don't really worry about oversaturation. But I do think I think there was a time where you could, if you brewed, that was enough. But now you got to have something. It better be good, got to be good and good food or whatever else. So, so those are kind of the trends I've seen that I would say might be concerning,
right.
For the industry.
And I think with also, as you got pointed to, with some of the things that breweries have done better in terms of doing delivery, having food, and other services, that in my belief, I feel that has made Michigan beer better. But in kind of a time where we're I keep calling this year the Return of the Jedi year of the trilogy, because we're still in Empire Strikes Back of 2021.
We are.
And we're eventually there's going to be that turnaround that happens where all of a sudden we're just going to be celebrating with Ewoks in December, and hopefully we'll get there.
What a great thought.
Yeah. But what I kind of see now is that with everything kind of making that turning point where we're trying to get back to normal pre-COVID, that some of those services are starting to go away. Like we're seeing the delivery go away. We're seeing, some of the food. I mean, you feel a lot of that stuff should just stay and keep that going, especially with the delivery, because I kind of miss the delivery.
I would love to see it. The only thing I don't want it to come at the expense of good beer. I think that just in my experience, a number of brew pubs have good food and beer, or great beer and food. And like, I'm okay if they have really good beer and food, like that's okay. So yeah, I'd love to see it stay as long as we keep getting good quality beer. I didn't actually use a delivery service, but it sounds amazing. I just think that's so fantastic. And that's what they used to do back in the day, right? They'd have to deliver the beer places. So.
Right. And I guess it's kind of going back to the book. I was kind of scanning through it and just kind of looking at the history and looking at some of those breweries that were out there. And it really wasn't a whole heck of a lot. I guess I'm curious how this beer even got around the States for people to even enjoy.
That's a good question. So what would happen? So just to kind of paint the picture and I constantly had to check myself when I was writing it, because I'm used to saying brew pubs because that's what we talk about. These were breweries. People would go there and the workers always drank, right? But they didn't have most of them, some of them had a saloon attached, but for the most part, they did not have a tap room where you would just, roll up to the bar, right? So normally what would happen is there would be the brewery in the town, and then you'd have the saloons, and then they'd put it in the barrels, get the truck. So it didn't get very far. In most cases, it didn't get very far. There were some places that I read about that, especially in the Detroit area, that had a saloon attached. And there was a point where I'm not remembering the exact year off the top of my head, but what would happen is the saloons that would buy the beer. Somehow the saloons kind of got together and they were paying a lower price for the beer. So the brewery owners opened their own saloon, and then they could sell the beer and make a profit from it, which I thought was a nice little entrepreneurship there. So it didn't go far, but it was usually in the little immediate area.
Right. All right. I'm going to hand this off to Wendy because she's got a few.
I have quite a few actually because history and beer are two of my favorite things too.
Yay!
So we're very kindred in that sense. So you mentioned about the pandemic, and that was actually one of my questions because in the introduction you talk about it and how it's not exactly the book that you expected it to be. So I'm just curious, what would you have done differently, and is there going to be a follow-up?
Okay. So yeah, I'm glad that you asked that. So there's two things. So in my mind, when I was thinking of this in the summer, those halcyon days, the summer of 2019, when we were such summer children, in my mind, I thought, well, I'm going to take the summer of 2020 and I'm going to go around to places in Michigan and I'm going to go to libraries. And I'm going to go to breweries, brew pubs, and I'm going to talk to people, and I'm going to do all this intensive research. And the second part that I thought it was going to be, so when I love to go back and look at my proposals because they're inevitably the book is really different than the proposal. And I had this great idea. I'm like, I'm going to go and I'm going to find all the hidden stories of women and African Americans and people who were Jewish and people who were this and that. And I'm going to tell you. And I forgot I live in fucking America. And it's like in that shit, like, you know what I mean? Like I clearly forgot where I live. And I was like, oh, duh. So if those stories are out there, and God, I hope they are. And I have every reason to believe that they did happen. But the stuff that gets written about and the stuff that gets preserved in history is very much through the lens of the people that control the newspapers. I mean, that was, or if you had to have money, right, to put an ad in. So that's why in my mind, I'm like, I want to dig through shit and try and find like, that again, my timing is always as impeccable. So I think I signed the book contract. I want to say like March 20th or something. And by this time, stuff was shut down. So the editor, nobody knew which way was up. So my editor was like, you know what, just, can't even give you a deadline because we don't know. I'm like, okay. So probably 3 or 4 months went by and I really couldn't do anything. And then our library in Ann Arbor opened back up and I could get the interlibrary loans and I could get some books. But access to libraries are still closed. Some of the research libraries and historical societies, God bless those people. A lot of them, I would even say most are either volunteer or they have one person. They shut down. So trying to get emails answered even was not always possible. Same with breweries and brew pubs. I'm not faulting anyone. I mean, like I said earlier, they had to pivot. They had to figure shit out. I do not expect them to have time to answer an email from this rando person like, hey, I'm writing a book. So the things I intended that I wanted to look for and the things that I wanted to do just couldn't happen under COVID. And so I don't know necessarily me, but I think there is probably someone who could do that and find some stories if they're there. I mean, that's the thing that I've been looking and reading history for almost 10 years. I was kind of a late bloomer in history. So it's been almost 10 years I've been really into it. And I have seen more than one report that it was pay to play to get articles written back in the day about you. And definitely a lot of my research points were ads. So if you didn't have money for an ad in the Polk directory or the city directory, I'm not going to know about you to even look to try to find information that may or may not be there. So I'd really hope to be able, like I said, to actually sit and dig into some archives. And it really still is not really possible because things just still really aren't back to normal. So
it actually sounds like a dream summer to me.
I know, right?
Everything you just said, beer, libraries, I'm in. If you ever need a partner, I'm willing to help you out with that.
Road trip.
So what is one of your favorite stories to share that you learned during this process?
One of the things I did, well, I'll start kind of big and then I'll winnow it down. So just how, and I knew this and I know this, but just how incredibly amazing people are. And especially people who come here from somewhere else. may or may not have been leaving an unpleasant situation. Sometimes not. But they came here many times with nothing. And they're like, all right, I know some of them were trained brewmasters where they were from. Some just decided to do it. Just the incredible tenacity of people. Like people just keep going. And there were financial panics and there was just weird stuff that would happen. And they just kept going. And I'm like, that's amazing because I can barely get out of bed most days and I have a pretty privileged and blessed life. And I'm like, wow, how did they do this? So on a macro level, I'm just always impressed and amazed by people who can just make something happen and make a brewery in this strange town they've never been to. On a smaller level, there's a lovely story in Ionia where I've not been yet, but Clicks Corver is the guy's name, and he's the malt liquor guy. And he actually was making a malt liquor, which
he just got Rob's attention.
Oh,
Well, the only reason you have my attention with Ionia is that it has a special place because the courthouse is where we adopted our first child.
Oh,
it wasn't for the malt liquor.
He just totally, like you said that he's the malt liquor guy. He must have been like on delay or something because he snapped his head over to. Like,
Hold on.
what?
I am 100% sure, and I love Rob, but Dan is 100% the malt liquor guy on this show.
Yes, he is.
Without a
but
doubt.
it was Rob that snapped his head to attention as soon as she said that.
If you go back to some of these earlier shows, Dan was literally drinking King Cobra and Bourbon County on the same night.
Oh.
Mixed together.
No,
was it in a paper bag?
That was Milwaukee's best.
It was in a paper bag most times, yes.
Pass it around. Like, oh, that's wonderful.
Sorry, Wendy, I didn't mean to derail your conversation.
No, I kind of derailed it myself. I just thought it was really funny because just the look on Rob's face when he did it, he was like, what? And it might have been the delay. But anyways, go ahead, Patti.
Oh, that's okay. So it's a Grand Valley Brewing Company, and the guy was Clarence Click. Some of them had kind of fun nicknames. That was one of them. Click brewed a malt liquor using the Clicks method. And then I am looking at my notes. I don't know this off the top of my head. But it was around 1937 that he brewed a malt liquor, and it was advertised as this upscale champagne type of drink. There was also a person who... Oh, I'm sorry. There was a person named, last name was Gluck, and he was in Minneapolis, and Gluck had a grandson who kind of tinkered around, and he figured out how to make this beer in more of a kick. So that's the whole idea. Is it's like this, it's got a kick. It's this, whatever, more champagne-y, I guess we'd say. So looking at my notes here, and it looks like, I'm going to get the exact. Okay, so the Clicks malt liquor, our Ionia guy, copyrighted his labels with that name on it in 1939. The guy from Minnesota, Minneapolis, Minnesota, his malt liquor was not trademarked until 1943. So we don't actually know who, but the guy from Minneapolis, let me look at my notes here. He actually got a patent for his process. So it's on page 97 of the book. And there's just this, he had more in the book originally, just how it was like this, who came first. And we really don't know. Kind of the general consensus is this guy from Minneapolis, but our guy Clicks was brewing malt liquor. When I started researching this, I then dove down the rabbit hole of how malt liquor, then in the 70s and 80s, it kind of died out. And then in the 70s and 80s, some marketing person said, oh, we should start marketing to people who are not drinking our beer. And they picked they basically targeted cities with African-American populations. And that's a whole nother, I didn't have space in the book, but that was a whole another thing, how malt liquor has now turned into something different than what it really started out as. So I liked that story. I did not know that. So
while you were talking about that, it immediately made me think of champagne, which I will admit is one of my favorite things in the entire world. And it's very specific where you can get it. So I looked up where it was because I thought maybe that was it. No, it was actually 1939. Metropolis Brewing in New Jersey created Champale, which is a sparkling malt liquor.
Interesting.
But it fits right along in that timeline of what you were talking about. And I'm like, now I too am going to end up down the malt liquor rabbit hole.
Yep. But it's interesting how, like, around the same time, people just think of things, it's that fascinates me.
Yes.
Like, how did you think of that, Clicks? Like, what were you doing, bud? So
maybe he was in New Jersey visiting.
He's like,
So following up on that, I'm also interested in what you think is the most interesting thing you learned while researching the book. And is it maybe the same as your favorite story to tell?
Well, definitely reinforced my well, let me say this, that as I was writing this during COVID, I was quite depressed. And like most of us, we were like, what's going on? And it actually was comforting because I was reading stories about people who also had things happen, like prohibition, like financial panics, like all these things happening. But they kept carrying on, and that gave me hope. Like it sounds cheesy as hell, but I was just like, you know what, these people made it through and we can too. So that was actually one of my favorite things about writing the book is I'm like, you know what, they made it through in succession, prohibition, and then the stock market crashes, and then World War II, and blah, blah, blah. So that actually was probably one of my favorite things. One of the more interesting things there's a lot, but I just thought of as I was saying World War II. There's a little bit in the book about how the government actually declared breweries during World War II an essential business. And those two words would have meant not much to me a couple of years ago, but we remember the essential businesses, during the pandemic, and breweries were absolutely, and actually the federal government requisitioned, I think it was 10% or something to send to the guys overseas. So in their rations, they got, whatever they got, and then they got canned beer. What that did is it inspired brand loyalty. It's kind of like how now national chains like CVS and them, they'll open up in a college town, they'll take a hit on their profits, but you're building brand loyalty. And that's what happens. And there's myriad reasons why the beer changed after World War II. But one of them, absolutely, you had soldiers coming home and they wanted what they'd been drinking. So that just tickled me almost. I could just see the government doing that. And that kind of was delightful in a way. But so I thought that was kind of interesting. There's also a guy, I always forget who it is. One of the brewers was like Queen Victoria's gardener or some shit. It's in the book. You have to find it. It's just this random thing. I'm like, wow. And okay. So good for you.
I did find interesting that a lot of the history in the UP was based on, at the very beginning, they were there to provide beer to the military bases that were there. Yes. I thought that was I just think it's awesome. But I think Nick has a couple questions for you.
So starting the book basically at the height of the pandemic, or basically the kickoff of the pandemic.
Yes.
I'm assuming, I haven't had a chance to, flip through. I know the book literally just came out. Doing some of your research, probably doing interviews, either via email or on anything like that. Mm-hmm. As you were putting your book together, did you have a chance to make it to any of these, some of these breweries in the state of Michigan at all? Or were you trying to do this completely via like how we're doing our podcast here tonight, like Zoom and things like that? And have you had the opportunity to interview some people across the state when putting this together? Or?
That I'm actually going to do it a little bit backwards, but what I want to do, what I'm doing now is reaching out to places and offering to come and do presentations at libraries or historical societies. And I've gotten some feedback, which is great. I've been a public speaker my whole adult life. Before COVID, I curated 3 or 4 shows, storytelling shows and book reading and library presentations. So what I want to do now is try and get to these places that have the breweries and do it that way. And then if there's like Ionia, there's an Ionia brewing company. So I'd like to go, talk to them. Pretty much the research. I actually started the research by ordering a book. So people probably know this, but there's no money in book publishing. I don't know if there ever was, but these days, 3 million books are published every year, and there's probably 10 you can name, right? And those 10 authors are making millions of dollars. The rest of us, the 292,990,990, not so much. So I really didn't have money to put into it. So I had to wait till the libraries opened. And then I ordered a book, Brewed in Detroit by Peter Blum, who unfortunately is deceased. But if you want to know more about Detroit brewing, this book is phenomenal. Peter Blum worked for Stroh and had access to things I'll never see. And I started there. And I went through that book. And then Stephen Johnson wrote a Brewed in Detroit book. And I got that. And then I talked to Stephen, who unfortunately has moved, which stinks. But so I talked to him. I ordered Brewed in Grand Rapids. I talked to that guy. I ordered Brewed in the UP. I talked to that guy. That's where I started. And then and then the Detroit Historical Society opened back up, and they had that beer exhibit. And I went there and I wrote down names, and that was my jumping off point. And that's where I started just Googling, researching, looking up old newspapers, looking up ads and Polk's directories, city directories. So that's kind of how it started.
Looks like we might have lost Nick while you were going over that.
Nick was he looked a little frozen.
I know. I didn't want to look. I'm like, ugh.
No worries. We'll keep the conversation going. He's back.
There he is.
That was strange. Wow. Luckily, it was only for a few seconds.
Yeah. Thankfully, you didn't break the system. But Dan, what do you got for Patti?
So, reading through your book. Excuse me. You do have a lot of history about, Southeast Michigan, the UP. I'm curious because I see you do touch on parts of the northern lower, such as Sheboygan and Alpena. Was it tough to find more history for that type of area as far as history goes? And can you talk to us a little about that, of what you found and so forth?
Part of the hard part about writing history books or any book is I had a co-author for one book, and he said it beautifully. He said, the minimum number of words and the maximum number of words are not very far apart. So I had about 3,000 wiggle room words there. And so a lot of stuff got cut. I actually had a really nice chapter on Prohibition in Michigan, and they were like, nope. And that's okay, because there are really good Prohibition books. So what I did.
That's what I want to read.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And it would have just skimmed the surface, so I understand. But so what I did is I looked for there's a website that has the names of Michigan breweries in it, and it was just a list. It's just list and list of breweries, and so the book could have just been like a list. I mean, there was a lot. What I did then is I went through that entire website, every single city. And I searched for the names of the brew pubs. For a fair number of them, nothing came up. There was just nothing there. That happened in enough places. And if there was just nothing, there was just nothing on it. The other thing I ran up against, and this is something that I'm going to try to point out whenever I talk about this, is that we now are seeing more and more. So I want to say, I totally think we should pay for news. I don't think news should be free, but news that's 150 years old, I don't know that I can't really afford to pay for it. So what's happening, my first history book, I paid nothing. It was all there. My second history book, I Condé Nast, if you know that big multinational corporation. Okay, so this is sorry, I'm sidetracking. So the history book on Vanishing Ann Arbor, my co-author and I had our cover picked out. Stuff was going to print. Cool. We get an email from a place, and they're like, oh, we don't actually own the rights to that picture. And we're like, oh my God. Come to find out, Condé Nast owns a picture. and they wanted $1,000 to release rights to the picture. We ended up getting it for cheaper. It worked out. But anyway, I say that because what I found in this book is that in some cases, huge corporations are buying old newspapers, are buying archives and charging not cheap prices to access it. So in some cases, I simply couldn't get the information. But in a lot of cases, especially and I made an effort to not have the whole book be about Southeast Lower Michigan, right? That's why the UP chapter is first and the Southeast Michigan chapter is last, because I didn't want to, because we do get all the attention down here. So there was a lot of spotty information. I was lucky. I found somebody in Jackson who is a descendant of one of the breweries, and he has a website and he had information. So that really helped out. And then there were just places that just didn't have breweries. Like in the Thumb, Brewing was kind of there might have been smaller ones, but that was kind of the big one up in that area. And again, I lucked out. I found someone who had a relationship with the family, and it worked out. But it was frustrating. And there's just some places, again, that might have had a brewery, and I just didn't have access to the information.
That's fair. Now, you mentioned that you only have, so many words to put into a book. Mm-hmm. Is there any particular story or piece of history that you wish you could have got in, but you weren't able to due to that constraint?
That's a really good question. I would have liked to have talked more about brewers as politicians and community leaders. Near the end, as we get into the Detroit section, a fair number of them were mayors. They were on the Common Council. They were presidents of, corporations. One of the guys co-founded the Detroit Institute of Arts. Another one ran one of the amusement parks. So I ended up being a bullet point list, but that just shows what community leaders and how civic minded that some of these folks were. So I would have liked to get into that a little more. And then the prohibition aspect, because just the way people had to pivot to making ice cream, to making soda pop, somebody made cheese, just that to me is so interesting. Or they made the brewer's yeast that was sold. That I thought was interesting. But there are excellent books about that are out there.
Awesome. One final question I do have for you, mentioning how hard it was to find some of the information. Which area of the state did you find the most difficult, and what did you do as far as trying to find enough information to write about?
So I really leaned heavily on the UP beer history, the Grand Rapids beer history, and Detroit. Those were really good jumping off points. I think Flint, and I say this in the book, the definitive beer history of Flint is yet to be written. Lansing, oh my gosh. I had to subscribe to newspapers.com or something for a trial thing to get anything. And I still didn't get as much as I wanted. So Flint, Lansing, again, kind of the Thumb area, but they kind of were concentrated with this Brewing Brewery. And then kind of up, I'm showing on my hand, kind of in the northern lower mitten. And those are the places that, had I not been COVID, I would have liked to have taken a lovely little week in summer and gone around. So my hope is, and this is always my hope, is that someone maybe in Petoskey or Alpena or somewhere will say, hey, I'm pretty sure we had this brewery she didn't put in the book. And they research it and they write an article or they put up a website or something. Because I know there's breweries that are not in there just because of space. Or because there was simply no information. I mean, like I said, I could have written a book with listing names of breweries, but we don't want that. So my hope is if somebody's like, hey, I grew up in, wherever, she missed this. Because every presentation I do, there's always somebody in the audience who's there to tell me what I missed. And that's fine. But it's then cool, research it, write it, or tell me and I'll research it and write an article or blog post or something. So if someone jumps off and takes it as a jumping off point, man, that's great. If I can get someone interested in history, my job is done. Ooh.
Awesome. Ken, you have a question?
Yeah, having done a lot of research myself, especially with a lot of information, because for a good 25 years, we'll say Rex Halfpenny basically cataloged the entire Michigan craft beer industry. Everything from barrel numbers, openings, closings, everything he cataloged. So we're thankful that we have a great amount of information from 98 until 2020. But the time before that, there's really very limited information, especially as breweries came and went. And this is obviously pre-internet ages too. So everything that you need to look up for or look up to, if it wasn't written in a newspaper, it wasn't written in an article, or a magazine that's now digitized, it's hard to find. I was actually going through your book, and there was a brewery in Westland that I didn't even know existed, called Fire Academy.
Yes. I at the end when I list the ones that, like, yes, I know there was a few that I had never heard of.
So
it's speed ups now.
Okay. But the thing is that I searched just those 5 words in a row, like Fire Academy Brewery, and I couldn't find it until I had to put it in full quotations. And then the only thing it exists is articles about somebody buying the land or buying the building. So it's hard to find this information. But what was the hardest one that you did find? What was one that you spent a long time looking for, and that huge sigh of relief that you finally got the information on, that was just probably just overtook you with emotion?
So mine was Lansing as a city. It's the capital of the state. It wasn't a concern to me. I was concerned about some of the smaller towns, and I'm like, oh my God, it's going to be all Detroit and da-da-da. It was just there. I don't know. I don't know if there was a lot of time. The temperance movement was strong in the whole state. Temperance and later prohibition, and the Christian Women's Temperance Convention or something it was called. They were active. Maybe they were super active there. I'm not really sure. Anyway, so Lansing. So I'm like, I could find nothing on Lansing. I found the thing that I thought was, I don't know, it was kind of cool. It was a man and woman, Frederick and Anna Weinman, moved here from Germany. Looking at my notes again, not on the top of my head. So they move here, they come here, they have a 1-year-old child or something. They build this place. And it's such a great story, and that it happened in Lansing, my place that I couldn't find anything on. It just is perfect. So he builds this brewery, and I just love this, that the place was described, and I'm reading it, quote, "It was full of lusty Germans, heard singing, drinking songs late into the night." And that image makes me so happy. And so Frederick brewed in the back, Anna served customers in the front. They had a cabbage patch, literal cabbage patch. They had pigs, they had cows. And they're brewing this beer, and then they get a new next door neighbor. It is the Lansing Female Seminary. And it's not a seminary like we would think, like church. It was all women's school. And the headmistresses did not want lusty Germans singing so their students would hear. And so that led to a problem. They objected. Oh, they also objected to the smell of the growing hops, the brewing grains, the sauerkraut pickling, and pigs fattening themselves on waste malt. The German saying had nightly sing-alongs, and it aggrieved the school's leaders. They took it up with Mr. and Mrs. Weinman, and they kind of curtailed their stuff, and they ended up going out of business, not just because of this, I don't think, but maybe other reasons. But it was just such a wonderful story for a city I just had such a hard time finding anything out about.
Yeah, trying to find the information has just always been a pain as we're trying to do a lot of data collection, because as we want to make Better on Draft a place where you can go just to get that information of when a brewery opened versus closed. So a lot of that information, some of it's just lost to the ether. Some of it is impossible to find because you just don't know. You don't know breweries or the names of breweries or the changes. So we appreciate you, gathering this history because it allows for people who can use your book. And when your book, as your book is digitized, you can buy it on Google, the ebook, Kindle, Amazon, Arcadia Publishing, available for purchase right now. It'll allow us to spread the data and spread the information so that we can continue to regain the history that just kind of got lost as things go. One thing that I want to point out before we go into our final questions, I don't know if you guys were aware, but did you know Michigan still has a prohibition party that still has someone in the state Congress that is pro-prohibition?
Wait, like, are you saying like they're elected into Michigan's Congress as member of Prohibition Party?
Yeah. Yeah.
Stop it.
So it's like Ralph Nader the Fourth?
Yeah, if you look at a handful of Michigan Congress votes in the state, it's either the state or the House. I don't know which one off the top of my head, but there is someone who you could tell is a pro-prohibition and was against like the outdoor drinking districts, the laws to change in distribution, all of these changes that happened. They were obviously against, even though everybody else was voting yes for, because we were worried about the economy of the restaurant industry and the brewery industry. As we end this show, always everyone's going to have one final question. So we're going to start with Rob and make our way around. What is your final question for Patti here?
Oh, this is an easy one. And I always get a lot of shit about this myself, but why are stouts okay all year round?
Oh, so you read that thing? Yeah, I knew. People are, what's your favorite beer? Whatever's in my hand. Because you can do so much with a stout. You can put a raspberry flavoring with a stout in the summer. You can have coffee and stout. I can always have coffee and stout. You can have chocolate and stout, maybe for like Valentine's Day. My favorite stout is Neapolitan Stout from Saugatuck Brewing, which is a strawberry vanilla. So I just feel like there's the flavors I like are really enhanced by the stout.
Everybody always gives me shit. It's like, why are you drinking a stout in the summer? It's like,
because it's good.
Rob, bring up to those people. Why are you drinking an IPA in the winter then?
Yeah, there you go.
Yes.
It goes the same way.
Stout season is all year round.
Yeah.
All year round.
Thank you.
That's my question.
Let's bring it to the malt liquor aficionado, 40-ounce Ghetto Dan. What's your final question for Patti?
All right, Patti. So you're going on a book tour to talk about this, hypothetically, unless you have it coming up. And you get a chance to make one beer to have served at all these appearances. What's it going to be?
Oh, like a beer that exists now, or like make it up in my mind? Make
it up in your mind and kind of style, or what are you thinking? What would you make to
what a great question. It would have to be seasonal. That's the thing, because like when it gets to be September, I start wanting Oktoberfest and then the spice. And then I want I always drink stout. And so right now I'd want like some sort of like Scotch ale or something. And then it would have to be like, but if I could just do one, I would want to do, I think I'd want to make the people drink a stout in honor of me and Rob. I think I'm going to make them drink stouts in July with no air conditioning in the library or something.
Got to make sure it's like an 18% stout too, while it's 100 degrees with no AC.
Drink it. Yes, exactly. And give them an entire stein full. Drink it and then watch what happens. I think that'd be fun.
I think that's a great
Buy my book. So like, here you go. Yay!
Love it.
Nick, what's your final question?
When you're not on migraine pills, what beer are you normally drinking?
I like the Saugatuck Neapolitan Stout is one of my absolute favorites. I like coffee. Wolverine State Brewing in Ann Arbor has a coffee lager called the Barista, and some coffee beers, I don't know what happens but something weird happens. This beer is phenomenal. You can get a really good lager, which I think is really hard to make. A really good lager, and you get the coffee taste. And I went to a place called it's in Howell called Block Brewing. We went there after we went to this, my husband and I went to this trick-or-treating thing, and we stopped there, and they had, it was in October, and they had like a pumpkin spicy beer and an Oktoberfest, and they were two of the best ones I'd ever had. So I got to get back. It's kind of far from my house. I don't really go there, but so yeah, so that's what I'll take anytime.
All right.
Wendy.
So my question is, out of all the breweries that you learned the history of, what is the one that sticks in your mind and you wish was still around today?
Oh, wow. Probably off the top of my head, I'd say a place in Detroit they called the Old Brewery. It was one of those that went through a bunch of different hands and a bunch of different names. And it just sounds like it would have been a cool place to like hang out. But that really wasn't the thing. That it was a brewery. That would have been cool. And there were some places out in the western part of the state. Actually, to be honest, I think the Weinman with the lusty Germans singing sing-alongs would have been a lot of fun. That would be fun right now. We could piss off the seminary school with the temperance league.
I was totally thinking that when you told the story.
With the sauerkraut crowding and the pigs in the mud and the what not to love. Don't knock it.
Right?
Especially when it's 100 degrees and we have stout, man. That'd be a good time. So that might be one of the places too to hang out.
All right. And my final question, what's next, Patti? What are we going to hear from you? Written, vocal? What do we got coming up for you?
Well, I'm starting to set up different talks at libraries. I'm getting some really nice feedback. So I'm setting those up. I obviously love talking, so that have not been on a stage in 2 years. It's very upsetting to me. So I'm setting those up, and I've spent the pandemic learning to write kids' books. So I'm really hoping that can be my next publication. I'm a teacher and special ed teacher, and I don't see a ton of representation of my students in books. And if it is, it's like the blind kid who climbed the mountain, and it's like, that's one person. I want to see some realism. So that is what I would like to do. So we will see.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate you coming in, especially on short notice.
It was a blast.
They can find your book. Arcadia Publishing is your publisher. Online, where can they find you? Where can they find out more about you and all the rest of the books that you've made?
You can go to Teacher Patti with an I.com. You're going to notice a theme. Twitter, I'm not super active. Twitter is very upsetting to me. Teacher Patti with an I on Twitter. Teacher Patti S on Instagram, because somebody else got Teacher Patti first. And then Facebook, if you just look up Patti Smith Ann Arbor, my little thing says I'm Ann Arbor Patti Smith, not the famous one, because long ago there was a Facebook thread and I was commenting and this guy thought I was the rock star Patti Smith and was literally pissed off that I was not her. And I'm like, if you look at it's my face, and if you hover over it, it's like special ed teacher Ann Arbor. And I'm like, I'm so sorry to disappoint you. I'm so sorry. I have ruined you. So that's why it says that. So no one misunderstands anymore. But yes, find me or buy the book and email and tell me what I missed or whatever.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate it. We will be back in about 8 to 10 minutes for the news segment of Better on Draft. No matter what you think of your beer, we think it's Better on Draft. Have a good night.
Peace.